Welcome to Local World TV on the Geopolitico.com for August 30th, 2010. Today, Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, made a very interesting statement. He said the most significant threat to national security is the federal debt. It was a follow-on comment to an earlier statement made by President Obama in the National Security Strategy document released earlier this year, that the foundation for American leadership must be a prosperous economy. Today, the spiraling debt of $13.4 trillion is already beginning to affect American foreign policy, but also the global order. It will affect it even more so in the coming years. That debt of $13.4 trillion amounts to $43,000 per citizen, and each year the deficit is adding over $1 trillion to the debt. And in fact, over the next 10 years, the deficit, which this year was or is in 2010 $1.4 trillion, is not expected to fall below $1 trillion. And even after 2020, it likely will still continue to be above $1 trillion easily with current spending patterns. Now, out of that $13.4 trillion of current debt, the public debt, that means excluding liabilities and payments due for Social Security and Medicare, is $8.85 trillion of debt. That means the U.S. government owes to non-governmental entities $8.85 trillion. That's 62% of its GDP. Now, this is up from approximately 30% of its GDP a few years ago, and it was in the beginning parts of the Clinton years about 50% of GDP. What is an interesting pattern is that of this $8.85 billion of public debt owed to external parties, 50% of it is owed to foreign-based entities. And of the foreign owed debt, over 50% is likely owed to China. Now, this is not a certain number, because people think that of the foreign-owned debt, China has from anywhere from 25% to 70% of it. And why we can't tell is because a lot of it gets held through intermediary accounts in places like London or other offshore banks. But either way, China is holding an increasing amount of U.S. debt. So each year, the United States is running $1 trillion plus deficit. Now, with decreasing growth, etc., this is going to become more of an acute issue. Obviously, there's the pressure internally when you have a defense budget of about $700 billion, which is a third of all U.S. spending. It becomes much more difficult to finance this increasing defense budget. So how do you have a central command that the U.S. currently has from Lebanon all the way to Pakistan when you have this spiraling debt and an enormous defense budget that you can no longer sustain? So that's an inherent risk internally. But if you take this even a step further, if the U.S. needs financing each year for $1 trillion, who's it going to? Well, it's going to primarily reserve-rich countries. That means countries that have an import-export imbalance, so a surplus, a trade surplus, like a China, which then has excess currency reserves, and countries which have high reserves due to the selling of commodities like oil, and so they have tremendous U.S. dollar reserves. So these two groups end up investing in U.S. bonds and securities. So here we have the U.S. each year needs to be financing $1 trillion plus of debt, and it turns to China and pretty much Middle Eastern oil economies. What is that situation? Now, you have a definitive dependency relationship. Now, some people would say, well, China and the Middle East rely on the U.S. and need its economy to succeed, and there's some type of mutually assured economic destruction. But when we saw Obama's recent trip to China, or his inaugural trip to China last year, he was very delicate and hands-off. in his discussion of policies towards China, Taiwan, human rights, and so forth. You can be rest assured that when the president visits Saudi Arabia, he's not going to be vocal on human rights. You can also be comfortable with the fact or uncomfortable with the fact that Israel becomes less of a strategic priority. In fact, over the next 10 years, the U.S. will need not just the oil from Gulf economies, but they will need the reinvestment into U.S. bonds and securities from those very Gulf economies. So all of a sudden, you have this spiraling debt and deficit that not only is an internal risk on defense spending and the general economic prosperity of the United States, but is also going to have a tremendous impact on the way the U.S. conducts itself around the world and how other countries respond to the United States. Well, that's Local World TV today. Thanks for joining us. Join us again next week, and always remember, globalize your mind. Thank you.